Hi friends, Mindy here. Welcome back to another Word Study Wednesday. Today I am going to be looking at the word content. I am also going to answer a question about how I choose this word. This is a question that I get quite a lot. I had it on my last video, how I select this word. But first I want to read the verse that I'm going to be focusing on today, which is Hebrews 13:5. Reading from the King James, it says, "Let your conversation be without covetousness, and be content with such things as ye have, for he has said, I will never leave thee nor forsake thee." And I like to throw in the next verse. So it says, "So that we may boldly say, the Lord is my helper, and I will not fear what man shall do unto me." So I have to be honest about sometimes when I pick a word, it's because it's been something that I've heard at church or something I have studied or from a devotional or whatever. But this week, this is just the truth. I was praying about something, and I found myself over the course of a few days just kind of repeating myself a lot. Like I was really praying about this one thing. Instead of just praying about it and leaving it with the Lord, I just kept picking it back up, and it was just I just kept bringing it up and bringing it up, and I felt the Lord kind of just say content. Like that was the word that just kind of dropped into my spirit. And so I felt a little bit like I was getting a little bit of a spanking, a little bit. And then maybe this has never happened to you all, but I just kind of, I was just praying about the same thing over and over. And but then when I came across this verse, it was almost like the way it just reminded me so much of kind of how you do when you're a parent and you have little kids and you have to discipline them, and but afterwards you kind of give, you love on them a little bit. And I felt like that's exactly what happened here, because he kind of, spanked me a little bit with like, you need to calm down and be content. And then he also came back with the rest of this verse that says, I will never leave you or forsake you. And so that I can boldly say, the Lord is my helper. I don't have to worry about, all of the things. I can be content with my circumstances as they are right now. And so that is how I came to this word. To be honest, it was just because the Lord kind of was chastising me a little bit for me just, not being very content, I guess. So anyway, while I was blabbering on, I wrote about the parsing of this word, which is from the Strong's G714. I used some stickers that I have from By the Well for God, the tile alphas, to put that number out there. I wrote the parsing, which is a verb. I also made a note that this is referring back to your conversation and your conduct as the subject of it. So like how you're behaving yourself. And then I also wrote for the root that this is, and I wrote this exactly how this says in Blue Letter Bible. It says, apparently this is a primary word akin to G142 through the idea of raising a barrier, which I thought was really interesting. And then the definition is to ward off, to avail or be satisfactory, be content, be enough, suffice, or be sufficient. And then the outline of biblical usage is also really interesting. And it says to be possessed of unfailing strength, to be strong, to suffice, to be enough, to defend or ward off, to be satisfied, to be contented. Now, in ourselves, we do not have unfailing strength. That is why we need the Lord, but he has said he will never leave us. So we can rely on his unfailing strength. So over here in the notes and nugget section, as always, I'm going to write out some of the verses that have this word in them. So this first one that I'm writing out is Matthew 25:9. I'm using these stickers. These are like clear label stickers from By the Well. This was actually part of a goodie that was given at a retreat that I was at. And so I love these little clear label stickers so much. And so you just have to use a slick writer. I'm using a Mr. Pen version to be able to write on them. So anyway, Matthew 25:9 says, but the wise answered, saying, not so, lest there be not enough for us and you, but go ye rather to them that sell and buy for yourselves. And so this is that section where it's the 5 wise and the 5 foolish virgins. And they're talking about, getting prepared for the bridegroom and making sure that there was oil in their lamps, and the ones who were unprepared were trying to take away from the ones who were prepared. And they said, no, we can't do that, lest there not be enough. So that be not enough section is that same word as content, not sufficient. And then 2 Corinthians 12:9 says, "And he said unto me, My grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in weakness. Most gladly, therefore, will I rather glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me." This word sufficient here is the same Greek word as content, which I thought was really interesting, again, because it's tying back into that idea of strength, but it's God's strength that we're relying on. His strength is sufficient for us. His strength is enough. We can be content in his strength. And so I just felt like that was really an interesting tie-in there. The next verse I'm going to write down is 1 Timothy 6:8. And it says, "And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content." So that idea, be therewith content, that phrase is that same G714. And earlier in this chapter, a couple verses prior, it says, "Godliness with contentment is great gain." And that word contentment is kind of tied in. It's not the same exact root word, but that idea is kind of tied in, and I'll explain that a little bit more in a little bit. But so I just wrote out this. There were a few other words or a few other verses, but I just wrote down these three. And here I'm just highlighting the section of it that is the Strong's number. And then I'm coming back over to the Lexicon section, and I'm writing G841 and G842. And these are translated the same. So G842 in particular is what I'm going to be looking at. So over here on the right side, I want to do a little bit of a dive into G842 because it's the same word content. And this is actually a word that I thought was going, or a verse that I thought was going to show up with this original study, but it didn't. And that is Philippians 4:11, which says, "Not that I speak in respect of want, for I have learned in whatsoever state I am therewith to be content." So I was expecting this verse to have the same root word, but it doesn't. However, it is pulled from G714 and also G846, which is kind of the notes that I'm going to take here. But interestingly enough, though, this word, this G842 is only used here in Philippians. And so these are the kind of little notes or additional notes that I'm going to write here. Sometimes I think it's good to kind of compare and contrast words instead of just focusing on one. So these words are tied together in a certain way, but they're not exactly the same root word. And so I'm just writing out here that this word content is actually from G846 and G714, that it's only used here in this verse in Philippians. And then I'm going to go through, like I did with the other version of content, and I'm going to write down the outline of biblical usage because it's different. And so here, this is saying sufficient for one's self, strong enough or possessing enough to need no aid or support, independent of external circumstances. So having this contentment that is regardless of your circumstances. And then the last point that it makes for the biblical usage is that you're contented with one's lot, with one's means, though the slenderest. So no matter what state you find yourself in, as he's writing, that you can be content, which is kind of an inward idea. And then I went on into the main takeaway here, and I started with a Matthew Henry quote, which says, "What God gives us from day to day, we must be content with." And that he speaks to that being a way to be pleasing to the Lord. And then the last thing that I wrote is just that we can be content because we have the assurance that he is always with us. He is sufficient to meet every need, and we can come boldly to him and say he is my helper. He has provided all of the things that we need. And so this idea of being content with not just the things that he provides, but being content with the strength and support and his grace and all of those things is also a layer of contentment. Not just with the food or the car we drive or what are those things. Obviously we should be content with those too, but just resting in his care also. And so you can see I went through and added a few little stickers. I'm trying to kind of color code these two words that I'm looking at here. So this G842, I'm adding some of the little teal bullet point stickers, and I love these little Bible bits stickers from By the Well for God. They're great for these types of studies. And then for the outline of biblical usage for the other version of content, I'm using that in the kind of pink color. And this and just helps my brain to kind of tie them together. And like I said, I was really surprised that this verse in Philippians 4 was not the same as the verse in Hebrews, but that's why these studies are so beneficial. So anyway, if you liked this video, I would appreciate it if you gave it a thumbs up. Subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And until next time, bye.